The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting a golden glow on the neatly trimmed lawns and tree-lined streets. Birds chirped softly in the distance, and the air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. It was an ordinary morning, like any other, but for 12-year-old Maya Johnson, it would soon turn into something far from normal. Maya walked briskly along the sidewalk, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders as she made her way to school. Her best friend, Tasha, walked beside her, chattering excitedly about the upcoming science fair. Maya listened with a smile, occasionally chiming in with ideas for their project. The two girls had been friends since kindergarten, and they shared everything: dreams, secrets, and even snacks during lunch breaks. As they passed by rows of houses, Maya absent-mindedly touched her braids, which were styled neatly by her grandmother earlier that morning. Her hair wasn't just hair, it was part of who she was. Each braid told a story, a connection to her roots and culture. She loved how it felt when the wind caught it, or how people sometimes complimented her on its beauty. Today, though, she didn't think much about it. She was more focused on getting to class on time and avoiding Mrs. Peterson's stern glare if they were late again. A few blocks away, Officers Harris and Doyle sat in their patrol car, sipping coffee from paper cups. They had been partners for years and prided themselves on keeping the neighborhood safe. But behind closed doors, their reputation was less than stellar. Residents whispered about how they seemed to target certain groups more than others, always pulling over cars driven by black families or stopping teenagers simply because of the color of their skin. No one dared to speak up too loudly, fearing retaliation or trouble with the department. That morning, as Harris drove slowly down the street, his eyes landed on Maya and Tasha. He nudged Doyle, nodding toward the girls. "Hey, isn't that the kid who matches the description?" he said casually, though there hadn't been any recent reports matching Maya's appearance. Doyle squinted through the windshield. "Could be," he replied with a shrug. "Let's check it out." Without hesitation, the cruiser pulled up alongside the sidewalk. The sudden sound of tires screeching startled both Maya and Tasha. They froze mid-step, unsure what was happening. When Officer Harris stepped out of the car, his towering figure cast a shadow over them. His voice boomed as he demanded, "You there? Stop right there." Maya's heart raced. What could this man possibly want with her? She glanced at Tasha, whose wide eyes mirrored her own confusion. Swallowing hard, Maya forced herself to stay calm. "I'm just going to school," she said politely, clutching the straps of her backpack tighter. But Officer Harris wasn't satisfied. He asked for identification, his tone growing sharper with each word. When Maya hesitated, explaining she didn't carry ID to school, Officer Doyle joined in, accusing her of being difficult. The situation quickly spiraled out of control, leaving Maya feeling cornered and afraid. Little did she know, this encounter would change her life, and the lives of everyone involved, in ways no one could have predicted. As the patrol car came to a halt beside Maya and Tasha, the atmosphere shifted. The once peaceful morning now felt heavy with tension. Officer Harris stepped out of the vehicle, his boots thudding against the pavement as he approached the two girls. His stern expression and towering frame made him seem larger than life, and Maya instinctively took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Stop right there," Harris barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "What's your name? Where are you headed?" Maya swallowed hard, trying to steady her trembling voice. "My name is Maya. I'm going to school," she replied, gesturing toward the direction of the building just a few blocks away. She glanced at Tasha, hoping her friend might say something to ease the situation, but Tasha stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. Officer Doyle emerged from the passenger side of the cruiser, his arms crossed as he surveyed the scene. He looked at Maya's braids, then exchanged a glance with Harris. "You sure about that?" Doyle asked skeptically. "We've had reports of vandalism around here lately. Someone matching your description was seen in the area." Maya blinked in confusion. "Matching my description? But I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just walking to school." Her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Instead of listening, Harris reached for his belt, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "If you're innocent, then you won't mind coming with us to clear things up," he said coldly. Before Maya could protest, he grabbed her arm firmly and began leading her toward the patrol car. Tasha finally found her voice. "Wait, you can't do this. She didn't do anything," she shouted, stepping forward. But Doyle blocked her path, his hand raised in warning. "Stay out of this, kid, unless you want trouble too," he snapped. Maya struggled against Harris's grip, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please, let me go. I swear I didn't do anything wrong," she pleaded. But her protests only seemed to irritate the officers further. Doyle opened the back door of the cruiser, and Harris pushed Maya inside, ignoring her cries. The metal bars separating the front seat from the back made her feel trapped, like an animal in a cage. Tasha watched helplessly as the car pulled away, leaving her alone on the empty sidewalk. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, dialing Maya's grandmother. "They took her," Tasha stammered through sobs. "The police, they just grabbed her." Meanwhile, in the back seat of the patrol car, Maya hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She replayed the events in her mind, searching for some explanation. Had she accidentally broken a rule? Was there really a report about vandalism? Or was it something else entirely? The officers remained silent as they drove, their faces unreadable. Every bump in the road jolted Maya, making her feel even smaller and more vulnerable. She stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by until they arrived at the police station. The building loomed ahead, its brick walls cold and unwelcoming. When the car stopped, Harris yanked open the door and pulled Maya out roughly. Doyle followed close behind, muttering under his breath about how kids these days didn't know respect. They led her inside, past rows of desks and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Maya's legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to keep moving, clinging to the hope that someone would realize this was all a mistake. But deep down, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Something told her this wasn't about vandalism or mistaken identity. This was about something far bigger and far uglier than she could have imagined. Inside the police station, the air was cold and sterile, filled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of keyboards clacking. Maya sat on a hard wooden chair in a small windowless room, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. Her braids, which she had been so proud of that morning, now felt like a weight pressing down on her. She kept her head low, trying to avoid eye contact with Officers Harris and Doyle, who stood nearby, whispering to each other. Harris smirked as he leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "You know, kid, maybe if you took better care of yourself, people wouldn't mistake you for trouble," he said casually, his tone dripping with mockery. Doyle chuckled, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, those braids. They're not exactly school material," he added, sneering as he gestured toward her hair. Maya's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. She wanted to scream, to tell them how wrong they were, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she stared at the floor, blinking back tears. The officer's laughter echoed in the tiny room, making her feel even smaller than before. After what felt like an eternity, Doyle straightened up and glanced at Harris. "You know what? Maybe we should teach her a lesson about respect," he suggested, his voice low but deliberate. Harris raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. Doyle grinned, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Let's clean her up a bit, show her what happens when you don't follow the rules." Without another word, Doyle left the room, returning moments later with a pair of scissors and a disposable razor. Maya's heart sank as she realized what they intended to do. "No," she cried, standing up abruptly. "Please, don't touch my hair. It's not fair. It's mine." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Harris grabbed her arm and forced her back into the chair, holding her down while Doyle approached with the tools. Maya struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the two men were far stronger. Tears streamed down her face as she begged them to stop, her voice breaking with every word. "Why are you doing this? I didn't do anything wrong." Doyle ignored her, his focus solely on the task at hand. He began cutting away at her braids, each snip sounding louder than the last in the silent room. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, unable to bear the sight of her beloved hair falling to the floor in clumps. When the scissors were done, Doyle switched to the razor, shaving her head until it was completely bald. The cold metal against her scalp sent shivers down her spine, and she couldn't help but sob uncontrollably. Harris watched with a satisfied smirk, filming the entire ordeal on his phone. "This'll show her," he muttered under his breath, laughing as he zoomed in on Maya's tear-streaked face. To them, it was just another day at work, a way to assert their authority and put someone in their place. But to Maya, it was humiliation beyond words, a violation of her dignity and identity. When they were finally done, Doyle stepped back, admiring their handiwork. "There, now doesn't that look better?" he taunted, his voice laced with sarcasm. Maya didn't respond. She sat motionless, her body trembling as she hugged herself tightly. The vibrant girl who had walked to school that morning was gone, replaced by a broken child who barely recognized herself. Word of the incident spread quickly. A janitor who had witnessed parts of it from afar quietly recorded a video on his phone and shared it with a local activist group. Within hours, the footage found its way online, sparking outrage across the community. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. Two grown men, sworn to protect and serve, bullying the young girl simply because of the color of her skin and the style of her hair. As comments and shares flooded social media, calls for justice grew louder. Protesters began gathering outside the police station, holding signs that read #JusticeForMaya, and enough is enough. For Maya, locked away in that cold, lonely room, none of this mattered yet. All she could think about was how empty she felt and how desperately she wanted to go home. The sun was setting by the time Marcus Johnson finally arrived home. He had been stationed overseas for months, serving his country with pride and dedication. This trip back was supposed to be a surprise, a chance to reconnect with his family after so much time apart. He carried a small duffel bag over his shoulder and wore a weary smile, eager to see his daughter, Maya. But as he stepped through the front door of their modest house, the warmth of home quickly turned to something far colder. The living room was crowded with relatives and neighbors, their faces somber and tense. His mother-in-law, Evelyn, sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she saw Marcus, her eyes filled with tears, and she rushed to him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's Maya." Marcus froze, his heart skipping a beat. "What about Maya? Is she okay?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Evelyn shook her head, unable to speak, and gestured toward the hallway. Marcus followed her gaze, his mind racing with possibilities. As he walked down the hall, he heard muffled sobs coming from Maya's bedroom. Pushing open the door gently, Marcus found his daughter sitting on the edge of her bed, wrapped in a blanket. Her face was streaked with tears, and her once thick braids were gone, replaced by a shaved head. For a moment, Marcus just stared, his breath catching in his throat. "Maya," he said softly, stepping closer. "Baby, what happened?" Maya looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with shock and pain. Seeing her father, the man she admired most in the world, standing there in uniform sent fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. She threw herself into his arms, clutching him tightly as she tried to explain between sobs. They stopped me on the way to school, Daddy. The police. They said I looked like someone bad. And then, they cut my hair off." Marcus felt a surge of anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm for Maya's sake. He held her close, stroking her back as he listened to every word. When she finished, he kissed the top of her head and promised her everything would be all right. But inside, his blood boiled. How could anyone treat a child this way? And not just any child, his child. Evelyn joined them in the room, explaining how the video of the incident had gone viral and sparked outrage across the community. Protesters were already gathering outside the police station, demanding accountability. Marcus nodded silently, his jaw tightening as he processed the information. He knew all too well how systemic racism worked within institutions like law enforcement. Years of military service had shown him both the good and the ugly sides of power, and he wasn't about to let this slide. That evening, Marcus called his lawyer, an old friend named Derek, who specialized in civil rights cases. Together, they began drafting a plan to hold the officers accountable. Marcus also reached out to local activists and organizations, ensuring that Maya's story wouldn't fade into the background. He wanted justice, not just for his daughter, but for every child who might one day face similar treatment. As the night wore on, Marcus sat with Maya, talking softly and reassuring her that none of this was her fault. He told her stories from his time in the military, moments when he'd faced adversity but refused to give up. Slowly, Maya began to relax, finding comfort in her father's presence. For the first time since the ordeal, she felt a glimmer of hope. But Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The system was rigged, and people like Harris and Doyle often hid behind badges and titles. Still, he vowed silently to fight with everything he had. No matter how long it took or how hard the battle became, he would make sure those responsible paid for what they'd done to Maya and to countless others like her. The next morning, the small suburban town buzzed with energy. News of Maya's ordeal had spread like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of anger and determination among residents. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding handmade signs that read #JusticeForMaya. Enough is enough, and protect our children. The crowd grew larger by the hour, spilling onto the streets as cars honked in solidarity. Local activists handed out flyers, urging people to stay peaceful but firm in their demands for accountability. Inside the police station, officers Harris and Doyle were starting to feel uneasy. Overnight, their actions had gone from being shrugged off as routine misconduct to becoming national headlines. Social media was ablaze with outrage, and reporters camped outside the building, shouting questions at anyone who dared step through the doors. For the first time, the two officers began to realize they might have crossed a line they couldn't walk back. At a hastily called press conference, Police Chief Reynolds stood behind a podium, his face pale and sweaty under the bright lights. He tried to reassure the public that an internal investigation was underway, but his words rang hollow. Protesters chanted loudly in the background, drowning him out. Reporters fired question after question. Why weren't these officers suspended immediately? How could this happen on your watch? What are you doing to ensure justice for Maya? Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson prepared to make his own statement. With Derek, his lawyer, by his side, he decided it was time to step into the spotlight, not just as Maya's father, but as a symbol of resilience and strength. As a decorated military veteran, Marcus knew how to command respect, and he intended to use that influence to amplify his daughter's voice. That afternoon, Marcus addressed the crowd outside the police station. Dressed in his full military uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, he stepped up to a makeshift platform. The moment he appeared, the chanting stopped. People turned to look at him, their faces filled with awe and admiration. Marcus took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium as he began to speak. "My name is Marcus Johnson, and I am Maya's father," he said, his deep voice steady and clear. "Yesterday, my daughter woke up excited to go to school, a place where she should feel safe and valued. Instead, she came home humiliated, violated, and stripped of her dignity by those sworn to protect her. This is not just about Maya. This is about every child who has ever been treated as less than human because of the color of their skin." The crowd erupted in applause, some people wiping away tears as they listened. Marcus continued, his tone growing firmer. "We will not stand idly by while our children are targeted. We demand accountability, not just for the officers involved, but for the system that allows such cruelty to thrive. Justice must be served, and reforms must follow. His words resonated deeply, galvanizing the protesters even further. Videos of his speech quickly went viral, drawing attention from civil rights organizations, politicians, and celebrities across the country. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #AccountabilityNow trended nationwide, putting immense pressure on local authorities to act swiftly. Back at the police station, panic began to set in. Internal investigators combed through years of complaints against Harris and Doyle, uncovering a disturbing pattern of discriminatory behavior. Emails flew between top officials, each one scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Chief Reynolds ordered both officers placed on administrative leave, though privately he feared it wouldn't be enough to quell the growing storm. For Harris and Doyle, paranoia set in. They watched news coverage of the protests, seeing their names dragged through the mud. Doyle muttered bitterly about overreactions and cancel culture, while Harris paced nervously, muttering, "This can't be happening." Neither man fully understood the magnitude of what they'd done, or the power of the movement rising against them. As night fell, the protests showed no signs of slowing. Candles flickered in the hands of demonstrators, casting a soft glow over the scene. Maida's story had become more than just a single tragedy. It was a rallying cry for change. And standing at the center of it all was Marcus Johnson, ready to fight not just for his daughter, but for a future where no child would have to endure what she had. The revelation of Marcus Johnson's identity sent shockwaves through the community and straight into the heart of the police department. For officers Harris and Doyle, who had spent years coasting on their perceived authority, this was a nightmare they hadn't anticipated. They'd dismissed Maya as just another kid from the neighborhood, someone whose story would fade away without consequence. But now, with a decorated military veteran leading the charge for justice, they were beginning to realize how badly they had miscalculated. Marcus didn't waste any time. The day after his powerful speech at the protest, he filed a formal lawsuit against the police department, naming both officers personally. Alongside Derek, his sharp-witted lawyer, Marcus meticulously outlined every detail of the incident. The unwarranted stop, the verbal abuse, the humiliation of shaving Maya's hair, and the systemic racism that allowed it all to happen. The lawsuit wasn't just about punishing Harris and Doyle. It demanded sweeping reforms within the department, including mandatory bias training, independent oversight boards, and stricter accountability measures. Behind the scenes, Marcus worked tirelessly. He met with civil rights organizations, sharing Maya's story and advocating for broader change. His military background opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Politicians and activists alike listened intently when he spoke. One influential senator even pledged support, promising to push for federal investigations into patterns of misconduct in law enforcement nationwide. Meanwhile, internal investigators dug deeper into Harris and Doyle's history. What they uncovered was damning. Dozens of complaints had been filed against them over the years, ranging from racial profiling to excessive use of force. Many of these cases had been brushed aside or buried by higher-ups eager to avoid scandal. Now, under immense public pressure, those same officials scrambled to distance themselves from the disgraced officers. Emails surfaced showing supervisors ignoring red flags, while colleagues admitted turning a blind eye to troubling behavior, all because Harris and Doyle got results. As evidence mounted, the officers' confidence crumbled. Doyle became increasingly agitated, lashing out at anyone who dared question him. Harris, usually the more composed of the two, started drinking heavily, unable to sleep as images of Maya's tear-streaked face haunted him. Both men tried to defend their actions, claiming they were just doing their jobs, but few believed them anymore. Even some of their fellow officers began speaking out, admitting privately that Harris and Doyle had long crossed ethical lines. Public opinion turned decisively against them. Protesters marched daily, their chants growing louder and angrier. Local businesses displayed signs supporting #JusticeForMaya, while schools held assemblies to discuss racial injustice and empathy. Maya herself, though still healing emotionally, found strength in knowing her story was making a difference. She attended rallies alongside her father, holding his hand tightly as cheers erupted around them. One pivotal moment came during a televised town hall meeting. Marcus sat on stage alongside activists, educators, and city officials, calmly addressing questions from the audience. When one attendee asked why he thought the officers targeted Maya specifically, Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with conviction. They saw her as vulnerable, a young black girl walking to school, minding her own business. To them, she wasn't a person. She was an opportunity to flex their power. But what they didn't count on was her resilience, or mine. The room erupted in applause, and cameras captured every moment. By the end of the evening, Harris and Doyle were officially fired from the force. Their badges, once symbols of authority, were stripped away amidst a flurry of headlines declaring the first step toward justice. Yet Marcus made it clear, this was only the beginning. True accountability meant ensuring no family would ever endure what his had. With each passing day, the weight of their actions bore down heavier on the former officers. They weren't untouchable anymore. They were pariahs, their names synonymous with cruelty and prejudice. And standing tall above it all was Marcus Johnson, proving that even in the face of unimaginable pain, dignity and determination could spark real change. The courtroom was packed to the brim on the day of the hearing. Reporters jostled for space in the narrow aisles, their cameras clicking incessantly as Marcus Johnson walked in, his military uniform crisp and commanding. Beside him sat Maya, her head held high despite the lingering trauma etched into her young face. The room fell silent as they took their seats, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Harris and Doyle slouched at the defendant's table, their expressions a mix of defiance and fear. Gone were the days when they strutted around with badges clipped to their belts. Now they looked like shadows of themselves, shrunken under the glaring spotlight of accountability. Their lawyer whispered hurriedly into their ears, but neither man seemed reassured. They knew the evidence against them was overwhelming. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Derek, Marcus's lawyer, presented the case with precision, laying out every detail of the incident. He played video footage of the officers dragging Maya into the patrol car, then showed images of her shaved head, her tear-streaked face speaking volumes even without words. Witnesses testified, neighbors who saw the arrest, the janitor who recorded it secretly, and even former colleagues of Harris and Doyle, who admitted seeing patterns of misconduct for years. But the most powerful testimony came from Maya herself. When she stepped up to the stand, the entire room leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke about how much her hair meant to her, about the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, her courage grew. "They didn't just cut my hair," she said, looking directly at Harris and Doyle. "They took away a part of me. But I'm still here, and I won't let them win." Her words brought tears to many eyes, including those of strangers watching live broadcasts from home. Even the judge paused briefly, visibly moved by her bravery. When Marcus took the stand next, his testimony sealed the case. With quiet authority, he recounted not only Maya's ordeal, but also the broader implications of systemic racism within law enforcement. His closing statement sent ripples through the room. If we don't hold these men accountable today, what message does that send? That power excuses cruelty. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm for Maya and her family. The once daily protests outside the police station had quieted down, replaced by community meetings focused on healing and rebuilding trust. While the scars of that painful morning would never fully fade, Maya found strength in the love surrounding her. Her hair slowly grew back, each tiny curl a symbol of resilience and renewal. She started styling it differently this time, not just as an act of self-expression, but as a declaration of her identity. "It's my crown," she told Tasha one afternoon while brushing out her braids. And no one gets to take it away again. Marcus, too, carried himself with a renewed sense of purpose. Though his military service had always been about protecting others, he now channeled that same dedication into advocacy work. He traveled across the country, speaking at schools, conferences, and town halls about racial justice and systemic reform. His speeches were powerful yet gentle, blending personal stories with calls for action. People listened, not just because of his medals or uniform, but because of the authenticity in his voice. Maya often joined him on stage, sharing her own journey of pain and perseverance. Together, they became beacons of hope, inspiring countless families to stand up against injustice. The changes sparked by their efforts rippled far beyond their small town. The Maya Act inspired similar legislation in other states, pushing for greater accountability within law enforcement. Police departments nationwide began adopting body cameras and independent oversight boards, while activists celebrated these steps as victories in a much larger fight. Social media campaigns kept the momentum alive, encouraging people to stay vigilant and hold institutions accountable. For Maya, school became a sanctuary once more. Her classmates rallied around her, organizing events to celebrate diversity and inclusion. Teachers incorporated lessons about empathy and equality into their curriculums, ensuring that future generations would grow up understanding the importance of treating everyone with respect. Maya even started a club called Voices for Change, where students could discuss issues affecting their community and brainstorm ways to make a difference. It gave her a sense of agency, a way to turn her hardship into something positive. At home, Marcus made sure Maya knew she was loved unconditionally. He spent hours listening to her thoughts and fears, reminding her that she was strong enough to overcome anything. On weekends, they worked together in the garden, planting flowers and vegetables that bloomed under their care. It became a metaphor for their lives. Even after storms, growth was possible if you nurtured it with patience and love. As the years went by, Maya blossomed into a confident young woman, using her experiences to inspire others. She spoke at national events alongside her father, becoming a voice for marginalized youth everywhere. Her story served as a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to act despite it. And though she still felt moments of sadness when she thought about that day, she refused to let bitterness define her. Instead, she chose forgiveness, not for Harris and Doyle, but for herself. Holding on to anger, she realized, only weighed her down. In the end, what remained was not just a tale of survival, but of triumph. Maya's ordeal had exposed deep wounds in society, but it also ignited a movement toward healing. Through her bravery and her father's determination, they proved that even in the darkest times, light could break through. Justice might have been slow in coming, but it arrived nonetheless, and with it came a promise that change is possible when people refuse to stay silent. One evening, as Maya stood on a stage addressing a crowd of thousands, she looked out at the sea of faces lit by candlelight. For a moment, she thought about how far she'd come. From a frightened child sitting alone in a cold police station to a leader inspiring others to dream of a better world. Then she smiled softly and said, "We're stronger than we think. Every voice matters. Every action counts. Let's keep going, together." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing into the night sky like a promise for tomorrow.